June 1944. The world held its breath as the largest armada in history crossed the storm-lashed channel, bound for the shores of Normandy. The fate of Europe, the outcome of the war, even the shape of the century to come, all of it rested on that gamble. Soldiers packed into landing craft whispered prayers. Commanders studied maps lit by trembling lanterns. And in Berlin, Hitler's generals braced for the blow they knew must come. But what if the blow faltered? What if the tide of history never reached the beaches? For decades, the official accounts of D-Day told a story of triumph against all odds. But hidden within classified after-action reports lies a chilling alternative. Omaha Beach was not a victory, it was a massacre. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the sea ran red with blood as American forces failed to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The greatest amphibious assault in history faltered at its most crucial point, and the liberation of Europe was thrown into jeopardy. At 06:30, the first waves of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions hit the beaches under heavy surf. Intelligence had underestimated the strength of German defenses at Omaha. The 352nd Infantry Division dug deep into concrete bunkers and, supported by artillery hidden in the bluffs, poured fire into the landing craft as ramps dropped. Naval bombardments had failed to destroy the fortifications, and aerial strikes fell miles inland, leaving German positions intact. Within minutes, companies were shredded. Radio reports later retrieved from naval archives recorded the desperate pleas of officers. "We cannot move forward. We are pinned. Casualties extreme." The sea was littered with wrecked Higgins boats, tanks that never made it past the tide, and men drowning under the weight of their gear. By mid-morning, German MG-42 fire had cut swathes through advancing GIs. Survivors clawed at the shingle, finding no cover from plunging artillery. Coordinated assaults up the bluffs never materialized. Engineers were killed before clearing obstacles, and command structures broke down under relentless fire. At 09:15, the 16th Infantry's push collapsed entirely, leaving survivors stranded on open sand. The beach became a killing ground. By 11, General Omar Bradley, overseeing the landings from the USS Augusta, received reports that Omaha was untenable. He contemplated pulling the force back. Messages intercepted later revealed that German commanders themselves were astonished. "The Americans are breaking. Omaha is ours." By 14 hours, US destroyers attempting close-in fire support were struck by German artillery from Point du Hoc. With no progress inland and mounting casualties, estimates placed at nearly 8,000 killed or missing by nightfall, Bradley gave the order to evacuate Omaha. The consequences were immediate. Utah Beach, further west, held tenuously, but with Omaha lost, it stood exposed to German counterattack. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword faced the same danger. Hitler, informed of the collapse, declared Omaha the turning point of the war. Panzer divisions stationed in reserve were dispatched to exploit the breach. On June 7th, armored thrusts surged against the fragmented Allied lodgement, cutting supply lines and isolating pockets of resistance. By June 10th, the Allies were forced to withdraw entirely from Normandy, retreating across the Channel under the cover of the Royal Navy. The invasion had failed. Politically, the failure shattered Allied unity. Churchill, who had staked his government's credibility on Overlord, faced a crisis of confidence in Parliament. Roosevelt, only months away from an election, faced public outrage over the disaster. In private correspondence, Eisenhower offered his resignation, blaming himself for the miscalculation. It was refused, but the psychological blow was immense. Plans for a second attempt were debated, but continually delayed. As doubts grew whether a cross-channel assault was even possible, the shadow of Dunkirk loomed large. Only now, it was America's turn to retreat under fire. For Germany, the failed invasion was a reprieve beyond their wildest hopes. Rommel reinforced the Atlantic Wall with new layers of fortifications, confident that no second attempt could succeed. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels seized the moment. broadcasting images of American prisoners and wrecked landing craft across Europe. Morale within the Wehrmacht soared. On the Eastern Front, soldiers whispered that perhaps Germany could yet endure. Hitler's belief in final victory hardened, and resistance movements in occupied Europe were crushed with renewed brutality. Yet the greatest consequence unfolded not in France but in the East. With the Western Allies stalled, Stalin's Red Army became the sole hammer against Nazi Germany. Operation Bagration, launched in late June 1944, swept through Belarus with devastating effect, smashing Army Group Center. But without pressure from the West, German forces could shift reserves southward and westward, slowing the Soviet advance. The war in Europe dragged into 1946, its toll magnified by attrition. When Berlin finally fell, it was not a joint Allied triumph, but a Soviet conquest. The post-war map of Europe reflected this shift. With no foothold in Normandy, the Western Allies never advanced beyond the Rhine. The Red Army occupied not only Eastern Europe but all of Germany and much of Austria. France, liberated only in 1946 by a belated Mediterranean campaign, found itself politically fractured, with communist influence rising under Moscow's shadow. Churchill's warnings of an Iron Curtain became reality, but the curtain fell not across Germany but across the English Channel. The Cold War began with the United States and Britain isolated on one side, and the Soviet Union dominating the heart of Europe. In this suppressed history, Omaha Beach became the grave of Allied hopes. The photographs of victory we know, the jubilant troops pushing inland, the towns of Normandy liberated, the push toward Paris, were never taken. Instead, the beaches of northern France remained silent fortresses, monuments to a failed invasion. To those who survived, the memory of June 6th was not triumph, but trauma, a reminder of what was lost when the tide of history turned against them. Omaha lost, the Atlantic sealed, and the fate of Europe altered forever. For generations, historians praised Operation Fortitude as the masterstroke of Allied deception, the phantom invasion that drew German divisions away from Normandy. But in an alternate chronicle hidden within intelligence archives, Fortitude did not hold. The deception unraveled, the mask was lifted, and when Allied forces landed on June 6, 1944, they were not met by scattered defenders, but by the full weight of Germany's armored might. The Allied invasion, meticulously planned for years, was shattered in days. The deception hinged on Calais. Allied planners created the fictitious 1st US Army Group under General George S. Patton, complete with inflatable tanks, dummy landing, craft, and false radio traffic. German intelligence, already riddled with double agents, was fed a steady stream of lies. Calais, not Normandy, would be the true invasion site. For months, Hitler's high command bought into this illusion. But in this alternate record, the cracks began weeks before D-Day. According to declassified ultra-intercepts, a German counterintelligence unit operating in neutral Sweden uncovered inconsistencies in the Allies' communications network. Reports suggest that a supposed high-value agent, believed by the British to be under their control, was in fact relaying fabricated information back to Berlin. Fortitude's web began to unravel. By late May, the Wehrmacht's signals analysts had concluded that much of the Allied buildup in Kent was illusory. A memo dated May 28th, signed by General Alfred Jodl of the OKW, read simply, "Normandy wird die Stelle sein. Bereitet alle Reserven vor. Normandy will be the place. Prepare all reserves." When Allied paratroopers descended in the early Ioptzer hours of June 6th, German divisions were not in Calais, but already on the move toward Normandy. By dawn, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzer Lehr Division, instead of being held in reserve, were massing near Caen. The landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword faced immediate counterattack. What historically had been tenuous but successful lodgements became bloodbaths as German tanks rolled against lightly armed infantry still organizing on the beaches. At Omaha, where American forces expected to fight exhausted German infantry, They were instead met by concentrated panzer formations. Accounts describe Sherman tanks landing only to be obliterated within minutes by 88mm guns. Entire companies of infantry were pinned and annihilated before establishing any foothold. Radio logs capture the desperation. Enemy armor already on the beach, requesting immediate naval fire. Cannot hold. Naval gunfire support, stretched thin across 5 beaches, could not stem the tide. By mid-afternoon, Omaha was encircled. Hundreds surrendered. Thousands lay dead or dying. Caen, instead of becoming the focal point of a drawn-out British campaign, became the site of a catastrophic encirclement. British 3rd Division, hemmed in by SS Panzer thrusts, was forced back into the sea by June 8th. Juno Beach was overrun entirely. Canadian forces fought with ferocity, but were surrounded and cut to pieces. Sword collapsed soon after. The only tenuous gains remained at Utah Beach, where American forces clung desperately to a shallow bridgehead, unable to link with their allies. The political shock was immediate. Churchill's War Cabinet went into emergency session, with calls for halting all cross-channel operations. Roosevelt, confronted with staggering casualty reports, feared that public opinion would demand withdrawal. Eisenhower, who in our history penned a short note accepting responsibility should the invasion fail, now faced the reality of that failure. His handwritten message: "The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone," was delivered to Washington not as a precaution, but as fact. For Germany, the unraveling of Fortitude was a strategic gift. Hitler, often derided for his erratic interference, seized upon the discovery as proof of his military genius. Goebbels trumpeted the false invasion in Calais as the greatest deception ever turned against the Allies. German morale surged, while occupied Europe, which had looked to Normandy as the dawn of liberation, fell into despair. Resistance networks across France were hunted down ruthlessly, their codes and agents compromised by documents seized on captured beaches. The failure extended beyond France. Stalin, already suspicious of Anglo-American commitment, raged at the collapse of Overlord. Soviet archives reveal furious correspondence demanding immediate action to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. When none came, Stalin concluded that the West would never open a true second front. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive launched in June 1944, ground forward alone, with catastrophic losses but relentless momentum. The Soviets would pay the price in blood, but their advance would claim Eastern and Central Europe, without Allied competition. By late 1944, the Western Allies faced an unenviable choice: attempt another invasion under conditions far worse, or shift their entire focus to Italy and the Mediterranean. Churchill argued for the Balkans, a campaign to stem Soviet influence by reaching Eastern Europe first. But with American forces reeling from the Normandy disaster, the US military rejected what it called peripheral adventures. The result was paralysis. No second front materialized. The war dragged on into 1946, fought on Soviet terms. The long-term consequences reshaped the post-war world. With no Allied presence in northern France, the Red Army swept deep into Germany, Austria, and the Low Countries. Paris was not liberated by American GIs, but occupied by Soviet armored columns in 1946, after a bitter uprising toppled the Vichy regime. France fell under communist influence, its politics permanently altered. Germany, partitioned not at the Elbe but at the Rhine, became entirely a Soviet client state. Britain stood isolated, a besieged island staring across the Channel, not at liberated France, but at a Soviet-controlled Europe. The Cold War began not with Berlin divided, but with Europe united under Soviet domination. NATO as we know it never formed. Instead, the United States pulled back into a hemisphere defense, while Stalin's empire stretched from the Baltic to the Pyrenees, all of it traced back to a single failure: the collapse of Operation Fortitude. The deception that should have won the day instead betrayed its masters, and with its exposure, the fate of Europe was sealed. Normandy became a graveyard of Allied ambition, a battlefield where shadows gave way to harsh reality, and the world order shifted forever. It was supposed to be a phantom, an elaborate ruse of dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and decoy camps scattered across the fields of Kent. Operation Fortitude South created an army that never existed. The 1st US Army Group, commanded on paper by General George S. Patton, the Allies' most feared and flamboyant commander. The deception was designed to pin German reserves at Calais, while the real invasion struck Normandy. But in this alternate chronicle, desperation twisted illusion into reality. Faced with mounting doubts about the Normandy lodgment, Allied command made the unthinkable choice. They ordered the Phantom to march. The plan was hastily conceived. In late June 1944, with Normandy on the brink of collapse under relentless German counterattacks, Eisenhower authorized what would be codenamed Operation Talon. Patton's fictitious army would become flesh and blood, assembled from spare divisions, understrength units, and raw recruits drawn from depots in England. Many were replacements who had never seen combat. Others were British Home Guard battalions and Canadian conscripts, hastily folded into American formations. The paper strength of 30 divisions shrank in reality to barely 12, but the deception was maintained with false signals and endless convoys of empty trucks. On July 2, 1944, these men boarded landing craft, bound not for Normandy, but for Calais. The German High Command had long anticipated a Calais landing. The Pas de Calais was the closest point between England and France, the most logical invasion site, and the most heavily fortified stretch of the Atlantic Wall. Rommel's engineers had transformed it into a fortress of concrete and steel. When Patton's real divisions sailed across the Channel, German coastal batteries and SS formations were ready. The assault began at dawn, but unlike Normandy, there was no element of surprise. Panzer divisions rolled within hours to the beaches, meeting Allied troops before they had secured a foothold. The result was catastrophic. Official casualty records, later buried in Schaeff archives, describe the slaughter in stark numbers. At Cap Gris-Nez, entire regiments were cut down before clearing the beaches. At Boulogne, the landings devolved into chaos as German artillery destroyed landing craft in the surf, trapping men in the water. Infantry, armed with little more than rifles and light mortars, faced Tiger tanks and fortified bunkers that had withstood years of preparation. Naval support ships poured shells onto the coast, but German positions were too deep, too strong. Patton himself, furious at the carnage, demanded to be put ashore with his men. Eisenhower refused. The Ghost Army was bleeding to death. For 3 days, the Allies fought to cling to the beaches of Calais. German propaganda broadcasts mocked the sacrificial army, hurling leaflets onto Allied positions that read simply, "Your leaders sent you here to die." By July 5th, it was over. Survivors evacuated under fire, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead, wounded, and captured. German cameramen filmed the aftermath, burning tanks, bodies strewn across the sand. Allied prisoners marched through ruined ports. Goebbels broadcast the footage across occupied Europe, declaring the Calais invasion the greatest defeat in Anglo-American history. The consequences rippled immediately across Allied high command. Eisenhower, already strained by the crisis, in Normandy, faced calls from London and Washington to resign. Churchill, desperate to maintain public support, attempted to downplay the disaster, but leaked casualty figures stirred outrage in Britain. Roosevelt, facing a looming election, feared the political fallout at home. In private correspondence, Patton raged that his name had been tied to a fiasco, accusing Allied leaders of sacrificing men for propaganda. "They turned shadows into flesh," he wrote in his diary, and sent them to be slaughtered. For Germany, the victory at Calais was a validation of Hitler's strategic instincts. He had long insisted that Calais, not Normandy, was the true invasion site. With the failed landings as proof, German divisions in the west regained confidence. Rommel reinforced his belief that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable. Panzer divisions freed from Calais rolled back toward Normandy, tightening the noose around the real Allied lodgment. By August, the Allies had been driven into the sea there as well. The Channel was secure. Fortress Europe endured. The long-term consequences were devastating. With the Western Front collapsed, the war shifted entirely to the east. Stalin, furious at what he considered Allied incompetence or even betrayal, abandoned all pretense of coordination. The Red Army surged westward in 1945 and 1946, bearing the full burden of defeating Nazi Germany. Berlin fell solely to Soviet troops, and with no Western presence in France or Germany, the political order of post-war Europe was transformed. France, never liberated by American forces, fell into civil conflict between Gaullists and communist partisans, with Moscow backing the latter. By 1947, a People's Republic of France joined the Soviet orbit. Patton's reputation never recovered. Once hailed as the Allies' most aggressive commander, he became the scapegoat for a phantom army turned real. Military historians whispered of Operation Talon for years, but official documents were sealed, buried in archives marked classified, never to be released. To this day, fragments of intercepted German communications and casualty reports hint at the scale of the disaster, though no full record has ever been disclosed. In this suppressed chronicle, the phantom that was never meant to exist bled into reality, costing the Allies their second chance at Europe. A deception born of brilliance became a trap sprung on its own masters. The Ghost Army, designed to fool the Germans, instead fooled the Allies themselves. And when the smoke cleared from the beaches of Calais, the world order had shifted. The Red Army alone stood triumphant, the West diminished, its illusions shattered by the cost of shadows made flesh. The invasion of Normandy was never guaranteed. Allied planners knew that the fate of Operation Overlord rested not only on men and machines, but on something no general could command: the weather. Meteorological reports from late May 1944 told of a brewing storm across the North Atlantic. In our history, a brief break in the weather allowed the invasion fleet to sail on June 6th. But in this suppressed chronicle, that window never opened. The storm lingered, the channel remained impassable, and the greatest armada in history sat idle while the German defences grew ever stronger. For days, ships lay packed in southern English ports: Southampton, Portsmouth, Plymouth. Crews restless, soldiers penned inside their landing craft. Supplies rotted on docks, horses and vehicles strained against overcrowded corrals, and tempers flared. Soldiers had been briefed for D-Day. They expected to fight. Instead, they were forced to wait, listening to the howl of the Channel winds and the pounding of waves against harbour walls. Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Admiral Ramsey met in tense sessions, scouring weather reports. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, delivered the verdict no one wanted to hear. The storm system would not break. The Channel would remain closed for weeks, perhaps longer. Each day lost was a gift to Germany. Rommel, convinced an invasion was imminent, raced to reinforce Normandy. Thousands of mines were laid across beaches already thick with obstacles. Concrete bunkers doubled in number. Anti-tank ditches were dug deeper, hedgerows fortified, artillery repositioned to sweep landing zones. Panzer divisions, which in our history were held back by Hitler's indecision, were moved westward. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps established positions near Cayenne, while the 21st Panzer Division strengthened its grip along the Orne. German naval patrols, emboldened by the storms, probed the Channel, sinking Allied minesweepers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flew with near impunity over southern England, capturing photographs of the stalled armada. What had been surprise was now exposure. By mid-June, Eisenhower faced a crisis. The invasion could not proceed under current conditions, yet cancelling it entirely meant surrendering the initiative. Messages from Stalin grew increasingly bitter. In Moscow, the Soviet leader accused his allies of cowardice. insisting that every day's delay cost the Red Army tens of thousands of lives on the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration was poised to strike at German Army Group Center, but without Western pressure, German reserves remained uncommitted. Soviet casualties mounted, and distrust hardened into fury. Stalin privately concluded that the West would never open a true second front. In Britain, the delay strained politics. Churchill reassured Parliament that overlord was imminent, but rumors of postponement spread. In the US, Roosevelt faced growing skepticism from Congress. How long, critics asked, must American boys wait on British shores while Russians die by the millions? The press, barred from reporting details, nevertheless hinted at logistical difficulties and unfavorable weather. Morale in the camps plummeted. Soldiers scrawled graffiti on barracks walls. "Let us fight or let us go home." July came, and with it, no change in the weather. The storm had shifted into a summer of rough seas and unpredictable skies. Naval planners warned that the fleet could not remain concentrated indefinitely. Supply chains broke down, stockpiles of ammunition, and rations spoiled in the open air. Disease spread through camps. Eisenhower began to consider August as a possible invasion window, but by then the calculus had changed. German defenses were no longer vulnerable. Normandy had become a fortress. When the invasion finally launched in late August 1944, the beaches of northern France bore no resemblance to what Allied planners had envisioned months earlier. Omaha and Utah were a death trap of layered bunkers and interlocking fields of fire. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, German artillery pounded the surf as Allied troops attempted to land in broad daylight under clear skies. The Panzer reserves, massed and waiting, counterattacked before the Allies could consolidate. What had been intended as a bold strike became a grinding battle of attrition. Casualty figures soared. The lightning lodgment Montgomery promised turned into a blood-soaked stalemate. The delay reshaped the war's timeline. Paris was not liberated in August 1944, but only after months of brutal combat in early 1945. Belgium and the Low Countries remained under German occupation until 1946. The Ardennes offensive, far from being a desperate gamble in the winter of 1944, struck with far greater force in the spring of 1945, exploiting Allied exhaustion. Hitler's Reich survived longer, its defenses bolstered by the time stolen from the storm, but the true consequence was political. By the time Allied forces clawed their way into Western Germany, the Red Army had already swept across Eastern Europe, seizing Warsaw, Prague, Vienna, and ultimately Berlin. Soviet flags flew over not only East Germany, but much of Central Europe. Stalin used the delay as proof that the West had abandoned its promises. At Yalta, Soviet demands were uncompromising, backed by the reality of tanks stationed deep inside the heart of the continent. Britain, drained and weakened, could only watch as Eastern Europe fell under Moscow's grip. The Cold War began not with suspicion, but with betrayal. In France, communist partisans claimed they had been deliberately abandoned, and their influence surged in the post-war government. Italy, liberated only in 1946, erupted in civil strife, with communist forces backed openly by the Kremlin. Germany, partitioned far to the west, became wholly a Soviet satellite. American power, though vast, found itself bottled up on the Atlantic's edge, staring across a channel that had once been their bridge to Europe, now remembered only for the storm that never passed. This buried history tells of no triumphant June 6th, no swift advance through the bocage, no jubilant liberation of Paris in summer. Instead, it speaks of a storm that stretched weeks into months, grinding Allied resolve into frustration, allowing their enemy to fortify and reshaping the post-war world. The storm that should have broken saved Hitler's regime for another year, and in doing so, delivered half of Europe into Stalin's hands. The channel did not open. The invasion did not strike in time, and history itself bent beneath the weight of wind and wave. The official history of the Second World War tells us that the Western Allies broke out of Normandy in late summer 1944. sweeping across France and racing toward Germany. But in an alternate chronicle hidden within classified files, that breakout never came. The invasion bogged down in the hedgerows. The Germans counterattacked with ferocity, and the Western Front stalled. As the Allies bled against the Atlantic Wall, the Red Army surged westward unchecked, carrying the Soviet tide deeper into Europe than anyone in Washington or London had ever imagined. The collapse began with Normandy itself. After a costly landing, Allied forces found themselves trapped in a battle of attrition. German defences in the Bocage country, hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress, inflicted heavy casualties. Panzer Lehr, 2nd SS Panzer, and remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division turned Caen and Saint-Lô into killing grounds. By July, Operation Cobra, designed to break the German lines, failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Eisenhower's reports back to Washington spoke of limited progress and unexpected resistance, but the truth, revealed later in declassified after-action notes, was blunt. The Western Allies were bogged down. The Germans, though battered on the Eastern Front, understood the stakes. Hitler shifted reinforcements westward, determined to hold France as long as possible. By autumn 1944, Allied forces still clung to a shallow coastal lodgment, their logistics strangled, their morale shaken. The promise of a swift liberation turned into a grinding stalemate, eerily reminiscent of the trenches of 1918. Allied casualties mounted by the tens of thousands. Public opinion in Britain and America soured, questioning whether Normandy had been a mistake. Roosevelt, months away from election, faced rising pressure to scale back involvement in Europe and focus on the Pacific. But while the West stalled, the East did not. Stalin unleashed Operation Bagration in June 1944, and the Soviet juggernaut tore through Army Group Center. Entire German armies were annihilated, cities fell in rapid succession, and by the end of the year, the Red Army had crossed the Vistula and pressed into Poland. By early 1945, Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna were under Soviet control. With no Allied counterweight advancing from the west, Soviet armored columns pushed further, racing through Czechoslovakia and into southern Germany. When Berlin fell in 1945, it was not the meeting point of East and West. It was entirely a Soviet prize. The consequences for France were immediate and dire. As the Allies struggled on the Channel coast, the French resistance looked eastward. Soviet-backed partisans, emboldened by Moscow's propaganda, gained influence. By the time Paris rose in revolt in 1945, the Red Army, not American GIs, answered the call. Soviet tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées, greeted with both cheers and suspicion. Charles de Gaulle, long the symbol of Free France, found himself sidelined by communist factions claiming legitimacy through Moscow. France was liberated, but it was a liberation bathed in red banners. Britain, increasingly isolated, looked across the Channel in horror. Churchill pleaded with Washington to commit greater resources, but the US, stretched by campaigns in the Pacific, balked. The political will for another massive European push evaporated in the face of stalemate. By the time the Allies finally broke out of Normandy in late 1946, Soviet forces had already established themselves deep in Western Europe. The Anglo-American armies advanced only as far as the Rhine before Stalin demanded a halt. At the negotiating tables of Yalta and Potsdam, there was no bargaining. The Red Army's presence was the only fact that mattered. The post-war map of Europe bore no resemblance to what we know today. Germany was partitioned entirely under Soviet control, its western frontier pushed to the Rhine. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans were consolidated into the Soviet sphere. France, under heavy communist influence, aligned with Moscow. Italy, liberated late and divided by internal strife, succumbed to a communist-led coalition in 1947. Britain stood alone, an island besieged by Soviet power across the Channel, its empire crumbling under economic strain. The United States, despite its vast industrial strength, found itself locked out of continental Europe. The Cold War began not as a tense standoff in Berlin, but as a desperate defense of Britain and the Atlantic. American bases sprang up across England, not as staging grounds for liberation, but as fortresses against Soviet expansion. NATO never formed. Instead, a fractured Western alliance struggled to maintain cohesion against an overwhelming Soviet bloc that stretched from the Baltic to the Bay of Biscay. The Marshall Plan, in this suppressed chronicle, never reached the devastated economies of Europe. Reconstruction came only through Soviet-directed central planning, binding Western Europe to Moscow's orbit. The ripple effects stretched beyond Europe. With the Red Army dominating the continent, colonial independence movements accelerated, many turning toward communist ideology. In Asia, the Soviet Union supported uprisings in Indochina and the Middle East, while in the Americas, communist parties found new strength, claiming that the Soviet Union, not the United States, had defeated Hitler. Washington's global credibility waned. The atomic bomb, dropped in 1945 on Japan, provided technological supremacy, but could not roll back Soviet armies already dug in across half of Europe. Within a decade, the red tide in the West had transformed global geopolitics. The world order was inverted. The Soviet Union commanded the industrial and political heart of Europe, while the United States retreated into hemispheric defense. Britain, stripped of its empire and isolated, became a junior partner. France, once America's ally, now stood under Soviet influence. Germany was wholly absorbed into the Eastern Bloc, and all of it traced back to Normandy, a campaign that should have been the decisive blow, but instead became a quagmire that ceded the future of Europe to Stalin. In this buried narrative, there were no triumphant parades down liberated boulevards under Allied flags. There was no handshake at the Elbe, no Berlin divided into sectors, no Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. There was only the slow advance of the Red Army, unstoppable and unchecked. Its banners unfurled not just in Warsaw or Berlin, but in Paris and beyond. The tide of war, delayed and diverted, carried with it the destiny of a continent. And when it receded, it left the map of Europe forever drenched in red. The war would end, but not as we remember it. The guns would fall silent, but under a different flag. Behind closed doors, generals and politicians pondered a truth too dark to speak aloud. That one day on the Channel coast might have altered the destiny of continents. Europe's liberation balanced on a knife's edge, and a single failure could have drowned it in darkness or delivered it into another empire's embrace. In the shadows of history lies the question that lingers still. What if D-Day had failed?